The Navy's operations center was never truly quiet. Even in its calmer moments, the air carried a low hum computers whirring, printers churning out classified maps, radios crackling with half-heard transmissions from somewhere far across the globe. It smelled faintly of coffee. It had been reheated too many times, and the metallic tang of electronics working overtime. A dozen large monitors filled one wall, each divided into grids of satellite images, mission timelines, and encrypted comm channels. Officers moved briskly between workstations, their eyes fixed on glowing screens. The place thrummed with the kind of tension only a military nerve center could hold, half control, half chaos. And in the middle of it all, she stood quietly beside the SEAL commander, clipboard in hand. Her uniform was neat, but understated, no flashy medals, no ranked pins that caught the light. A simple Navy-issue blouse, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal the sinew of her forearms, the kind earned from years of carrying more weight than a clipboard. She wrote in clean, precise strokes, noting times, names, small details no one else seemed to notice. To the men in the room, she was an afterthought, a piece of the scenery. One junior operator leaned over to his teammate and muttered, "Commander's got himself a new assistant, huh? Wonder how long she'll last before she gets tired of running coffee." They didn't bother lowering their voices. She heard them. Of course she did. Years in the field had trained her to pick up on whispers through walls, on subtle changes in tone, on the faintest of tensions in a room. But she didn't react, didn't give them the satisfaction of a flinch or glare. Instead, she finished jotting down a coordinate update, flipped the page, and moved on. The SEAL commander, broad-shouldered, with a voice like gravel, didn't notice the exchange. He was deep in discussion with two other officers about an operation overseas. She stood at his side like a shadow, her presence neither interrupting nor intruding. Every now and then, he'd hand her a folder without looking, and she'd file it in seconds, placing each document exactly where it belonged. A pair of SEALs walked in from the adjoining tactical prep room, laughing about something. That had happened during training. One of them glanced at her and smirked before turning back to his buddy. She recognized the look, one part dismissal, one part casual arrogance. It wasn't new. They thought she was just here to type reports and fetch schedules. They thought. Her purpose began and ended with making sure the commander had his papers in order. They had no idea. From where she stood, she could see the big board, the giant classified operations map that dominated the far wall. It was a lattice of color-coded regions, mission markers, and blinking alerts. Most people would glance at it and see only a tangle of information. But she read it like a second language. The pattern of red and blue dots told her where pressure was building in two separate conflict zones. The timestamps told her which teams were moving too quickly, burning fuel reserves faster than their supply chain could handle. The placement of certain comm signals told her that enemy movement was faster than reported, and that someone, somewhere, was underestimating the threat. She kept these observations to herself. In the military, people revealed who they were not by their titles, but by what they did when they thought no one was watching. Right now, these SEALs thought no one was watching them, at least no one who mattered. They were wrong. A lieutenant walked in, handing the commander a thick envelope stamped top secret. He opened it, scanned the pages, and frowned. Without looking, he passed it to her. She caught it mid-air, scanned it faster than anyone else in the room could have managed, and without hesitation, slipped a sticky note inside with 3 bullet points written in sharp, decisive handwriting. She closed the folder and handed it back. The commander glanced at her note, and a brief flicker of surprise crossed his face, just a fraction of a second, but enough. "That's good," he murmured, almost to himself. He turned to the lieutenant. "Adjust the timeline." Push extraction by 30 minutes. Trust me." The lieutenant nodded and walked off. No one else in the room had noticed the exchange. She kept her eyes on her clipboard, but inwardly, her mind was running tactical math. 3 bullet points had just saved a reconnaissance team from walking into a kill zone. The intel packet had been wrong, and she'd spotted it before the commander even had time to process it. Still, she said nothing. An alarm pinged on one of the side monitors. A young comms officer rushed to mute it, typing furiously. Someone swore under their breath. Across the room, 2 SEALs leaned over a terminal, debating the finer points of an insertion route. She made another note on her clipboard. When you've operated in the shadows long enough, you learn the value of invisibility. She had been called many things in her career: operative, officer, ghost, but assistant was the one label that kept people looking the other way. And for now, that was exactly how she wanted it. The SEAL commander stepped away to take a secure call in the corner. She shifted her stance, scanning the room. Her eyes moved like a camera lens, pausing on faces, screens, small gestures. She took in everything: the scratch marks on a rifle stock leaning against a desk, the way one operator's boots were still dusty from a desert environment, the pattern of names on a sign-in log for the operations floor. All data, all useful. Somewhere deep in the building, a door clanged shut. The sound reverberated faintly, almost lost beneath the hum of electronics. But she caught it. She always caught it. She thought about the men in this room: tough, capable, confident. She respected them. They'd been through hell and back, and they'd go again without hesitation. But respect didn't mean she'd let them underestimate her forever. There was a time and place for revelation, and that time wasn't now. She glanced at the wall clock. 13:48 hours. Somewhere across the base, a convoy of black SUVs was already rolling through the gates. In 12 minutes, the atmosphere in this room would shift completely. In 12 minutes, a man with more stars on his uniform than anyone here had seen in person would walk through that door. And in 13 minutes, every single man in this room would see her differently. For now, she turned another page on her clipboard, her expression unreadable. The Navy's operations center buzzed on. The SEALs moved, spoke, planned, joked. They still thought she was just a shadow in the commander's wake. She let them think that, because the truth was far more dangerous than they could imagine. The Navy's operations center never slowed, but her pace never faltered. She moved like someone who already knew the rhythm of the place, precise, economical, never wasting a step or a word. Every task was executed with almost unsettling efficiency. On the surface, she was doing the kind of work you'd expect from a senior aide, logging mission updates, sorting through encrypted comm transcripts, cross-checking intel reports for errors. But if anyone had been paying close enough attention, they'd notice she wasn't just recording details. She was shaping them. A sealed courier pouch arrived at her desk, delivered by a petty officer who looked too young to be handling material, stamped classified, Noffern. She gave him a nod, broke the seal, and scanned the documents at a pace that would have made most people dizzy. Her pen moved quickly, not just making notes, but subtly reorganizing the information, highlighting what mattered, flagging what didn't, and rearranging the sequence so the decision-makers would see what they needed to see first. When she finished, the report was tighter, cleaner, and most importantly tactically correct. The commander, still engaged in a discussion about extraction points, reached out without looking. She placed the folder in his hand at the exact moment he turned for it. He opened it, his eyes flicking to the margin notes she'd left. A small grunt approval escaped him. Good, he muttered. Good wasn't a word the commander handed out lightly. She made her way to a secure comms terminal in the corner. The operator on duty looked up, startled, as she typed a string of commands into the system, without even asking for access clearance. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, inputting a verification code that bypassed the standard login screen. Ma'am? The operator started. Routing error in channel 4, she said without looking at him. If you don't correct it, you'll lose live set feed in 26 minutes. The operator blinked, checked his screen, and felt his stomach drop. She was right. How did you? But she was already walking away. At the operations board, 2 SEALs were discussing supply drop coordination for a forward-deployed team. She overheard them debating whether the drop could be pushed back by 6 hours to avoid a forecasted storm. No way, one of them insisted. The window's too tight. We'll have to run it early and pray the storm misses us. She stopped just long enough to speak. If you push 6 hours, you'll hit clear skies. The SEAL who had been arguing for an earlier drop gave her a look, a mix of amusement and mild annoyance. No offense, ma'am, but weather over there shifts too fast to predict like that. Satellite pattern over the northern ridge just shifted, she said evenly. Low pressure's moving east sooner than the model shows. 6 hours buys you a clean run. The other SEAL frowned, turning to his monitor. A few keystrokes later, the updated forecast flashed onto the screen. ... She single quotes us right, he said quietly. She didn't wait for acknowledgement. She just walked on. Her workspace was a simple corner table with a laptop, a secure phone, and a small stack of folders. But the real power in her job wasn't in the tools, it was in her ability to see the whole picture without anyone realizing she was looking. She handled everything from resupply schedules to encrypted message traffic. A normal assistant might have simply passed those details up the chain. She filtered them. If a piece of intel was flawed, she fixed it. If a tactical plan had a gap, she closed it before it ever reached the commander's desk. Some of the SEALs joked she had a sixth sense for problems. They didn't know it wasn't a sixth sense. It was experience years in situations where the smallest oversight could get people killed. Late in the afternoon, a petty officer brought over a stack of last-minute mission amendments, 4 different teams, all deploying to separate regions. She flipped through them, her brow furrowing slightly. One amendment caught her eye. The insertion point coordinates were wrong. Not by much, maybe a mile, but in the terrain they'd be operating in, that mile would drop them straight into a choke point. If the enemy had even a basic recon unit in the area, it would be an ambush waiting to happen. She reached for a red pen, circled the coordinates, and rewrote them with a new set based on updated satellite imagery she'd reviewed earlier in the day. She didn't stop to explain. The file was on the commander's desk within 60 seconds. When he saw the change, he didn't question it. He just initialed the amendment, consented to transmission. There was a quiet moment around 1500 hours when she finally allowed herself to pause, just long enough to take a slow sip from the black coffee she'd poured hours ago. It was cold, but she didn't seem to mind. Her eyes stayed on the mission. Bored, it was then she noticed 2 younger operators watching her from across the room. They weren't exactly hiding it, either whispering, glancing away when she looked up, then sneaking looks again. She could guess the conversation. She'd been in their position once, watching someone who didn't fit the mold, wondering what their story was. She turned back to her work, let them wonder. The pace in the room picked back up as new intel fed in from overseas. She moved between her desk, the comm station, and the commander's table with fluid efficiency, her mind constantly 5 steps ahead. A secure call came through from a field operative in hostile territory. She intercepted it, confirmed the encryption, and patched it to the commander's earpiece. But not before noting the stress in the operative's voice and cross-referencing his location with known threat grids. Within 30 seconds, she had a contingency plan drafted on paper and laid on the commander's desk, upside down, so no one else could read it. When the call ended, the commander picked up the sheet, scanned it, and nodded once. "You think ahead," he said quietly. She didn't respond. By 1645 hours, she had processed 12 separate intel updates, corrected 3 tactical errors, and rerouted 2 critical supply chains without ever leaving the building or drawing attention to herself. The SEALs still thought of her as the assistant, even when she made their jobs easier, even when she saved them from mistakes they didn't see. They chalked it up to clerical skill or lucky timing. That was fine, because she wasn't here for credit. She wasn't here for status. She was here to make sure no one got killed because someone else missed a detail. And soon, the one man in the Navy who knew exactly who she was would walk into this room and change the way they saw her forever. She checked her watch. Less than an hour until the Admiral arrived. The commander was still on the main floor, giving directives for the upcoming operation. She was at her desk, quietly finalizing a classified report that, if read correctly, would alter the course of 3 missions. Her phone buzzed once. A single text, encrypted and short, ETA 45 min. She deleted it instantly. The hum of the operations center continued around her. The men still thought she was in the background. The reality was that she was already shaping decisions they wouldn't even realize were hers. And in less than an hour, their world and their perception of her was going to shift. The announcement came over the comms with the clipped precision of someone trying to sound calm, but failing. All personnel, stand by for arrival of flag officer. Admiral on base ETA 10 minutes. It was like flipping a switch. The low hum of the operations center shifted into a sharper frequency. Conversation stopped mid-sentence, replaced by the rustle of uniforms being straightened and the scrape of chairs as people stood a little taller. Someone near the wall muttered, "Admiral? Here? That's unusual." It was unusual. Admirals didn't just walk into forward operations centers without a very specific reason. Their world was strategy at the highest level war rooms, Pentagon, briefings, political meetings. When one showed up in person, it meant something significant was in motion. The SEALs reacted instinctively. Boots shined, sleeves adjusted, badges squared. Even the most battle-hardened operators understood the weight of a personal visit from someone with 4 stars on their collar. At her table, she continued to work, flipping through a field report from a recon team operating halfway around the world. Her pen moved steadily, correcting a grid reference, flagging a line of intel that seemed suspiciously optimistic. If she noticed the ripple of unease in the room, she didn't show it. The SEAL commander moved briskly toward her. "Admiral's on deck," he said, more out of habit than necessity. He knew she already knew. She always knew. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone neutral. She set the corrected report on his desk. "Updated coordinates for Team Bravos. LZ. Trust me, they'll need them." He gave the page a glance, read her annotation, and nodded once. "Got it." He didn't ask how she knew the original plan wouldn't work. Across the room, 2 junior SEALs were whispering in low tones. "Bet he's here for the op in Sector Delta," one said. "No way, man. They wouldn't send an Admiral for that. Maybe he's here to evaluate command." The other snorted. "Yeah, or maybe he's here to meet her." He jerked his chin subtly in her direction. The first one laughed quietly. "Right, because the Admiral's going to fly halfway across the country to talk to the commander's assistant." She didn't turn, but she caught every word. Her eyes stayed on the papers in front of her. If they thought her stillness meant indifference, they were wrong. She was listening, storing the conversation away in the same mental vault where she kept operational data and coded messages. The minutes ticked down. The comm station lit up briefly confirmation, that the Admiral's convoy had passed the inner security checkpoint. The younger personnel tried not to look nervous, but she could feel the shift in the air. When someone of that rank walked in, every move, every word, every breath was suddenly subject to scrutiny. She had been on the other side of these moments. Before standing in the Admiral's position, walking into rooms where people braced up without thinking. But that was years ago, in places these men had never been. Now, she stood still, letting the SEALs prepare themselves for a meeting that would go nothing like they expected. The blast doors at the far end of the operations center opened. The noise inside the room dropped by half, as if the air itself had tightened. He stepped through tall, broad, his posture carrying decades of command. The dark blue uniform was immaculate, 4 silver stars gleaming on each shoulder. His eyes scanned the room with the kind of precision that came from a lifetime of reading people in an instant. Conversation stopped completely. Every SEAL in the room straightened. The commander moved forward to greet him. But the Admiral's gaze wasn't on the commander. From the moment he crossed the threshold, his eyes swept the space past the senior officers, past the decorated operators, past the commander himself, and locked directly on her. It wasn't a casual glance. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. She stood where she was, clipboard at her side, her expression unchanged. For a heartbeat, the room seemed frozen. A commander's hand, halfway extended for a shake, lingered. Awkwardly, as the Admiral walked right past him without breaking stride. A murmur rippled through the personnel, too low to be words. Boots shifted. Someone cleared their throat. The Admiral closed the distance in 8 purposeful steps, his eyes never leaving hers. The sound of his shoes on the polished floor echoed. In the stillness, she didn't move, didn't fidget, didn't look around to see the stares that were gathering like a storm. He stopped in front of her, standing close enough for her to catch the faint scent of salt and starch that clung to his uniform. His face was stern, but not unkind, the face of a man who had commanded fleets and buried too many good people. And then he raised his right hand in a crisp, flawless salute. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The SEALs stared, jaws tight, brows furrowed. Salutes like that weren't handed out carelessly, especially not from someone at the top of the chain of command to someone who, by all appearances, was a junior aide. The sharp motion of his hand, the exacting precision of it, told them this wasn't formality. This was respect. She returned the salute without hesitation. Her movement was smooth, economical, and so precise it might have been rehearsed 1,000 times. The sound of her heels clicking together rang out, sharp in the quiet. They held the salute for 2 beats longer than protocol demanded. Then, in unison, they dropped their hands. No one spoke. The commander's eyes flicked between them, searching for an explanation he didn't yet have. The junior operators exchanged glances, some with raised brows, some with narrowed eyes. The Admiral broke the silence first. "Good to see you again, Captain," he said. His voice carried easily across the room. And with that one word, Captain, the temperature in the operations center shifted. Several heads turned sharply toward her. The younger SEALs who had been whispering earlier suddenly looked like they'd swallowed something sharp. The Admiral smiled faintly, not the smile of a man greeting an old colleague, but the smile of a man acknowledging an equal. She didn't smile back. She simply nodded once, her voice calm and even. "Likewise, Admiral." The commander finally found his voice. "Sir, you two know each other?" The Admiral glanced at him, then back at her. "We've served together before. Different times. Different places." The way he said it made it clear those different places weren't anywhere on the official record. If the room had been tense before, it was something else now. Respect mingled with curiosity, and under it all, a slow, dawning realization among the SEALs. The woman they'd been overlooking all week wasn't here to fetch coffee or take notes. She wasn't here to learn from them. If anything, they might end up learning from her. The Admiral took a step back, giving her a small but unmistakable nod of deference before turning toward the commander. "Shall we begin?" "Yes, sir," the commander replied, but his voice lacked its usual authority. She returned to her place, clipboard still in hand, but she could feel the shift in the room without looking up. The easy dismissals, the casual assumptions, they were gone now, replaced with a quiet, unsettled respect. And this was only the beginning. The Admiral's boots struck the steel deck with crisp, measured steps as he closed the distance. Each step echoed in the operations center, a sound so precise and deliberate that the room seemed to shrink around him. Every officer present kept their eyes forward, posture rigid, waiting for his inevitable greeting to the SEAL commander. That was the ritual. The Admiral always acknowledged the commanding officer first. It was tradition, protocol, respect rolled into one. But halfway to the commander, the Admiral's gaze shifted. It was like watching radar lock onto an unexpected target. His eyes didn't glance, didn't sweep past, they fixed on her. The so-called assistant, with the clipboard tucked under one arm, standing still at the side of the room. No one spoke, but the tension changed in an instant. It was the kind of silence where you could almost hear thoughts forming. Why is he looking at her? Does he even know who she is? She didn't flinch under his gaze. Her stance remained unchanged, heels together, shoulders back, face unreadable. If she was nervous, there was no sign of it. In fact, there was a steadiness about her posture, a stillness that made the silence heavier. The Admiral reached the spot directly in front of her. And then, he did something no one in that room could have predicted. His right hand came up sharply, fingers together, wrist locked, palm angled just right. The motion was so precise, so practiced, it cut through the room like the crack of a rifle. The Admiral was saluting her. For half a second, it didn't register with the others. The mind resists breaking protocol, refuses to believe it's seeing something that violates the chain of command so blatantly. The SEAL commander's head turned, eyes narrowing. Several junior operators exchanged confused glances. A few even shifted their weight, unsure if they should be saluting too. But the Admiral wasn't offering a polite, casual greeting. This wasn't a friendly nod to an acquaintance. It was a full, formal military salute, the kind reserved for officers of significant rank, those who'd earned their place through years of service, through actions spoken of in secure briefings and unmarked reports. She met his gaze without hesitation. Her right hand rose, not in a rush, but in perfect counterpoint, mirroring his precision down to the smallest detail. The sound of her boots clicking together as she straightened her stance was sharp enough to make one of the younger SEALs flinch. For a long, unbroken second, they held the salute. The Admiral's eyes stayed locked on hers, as though acknowledging something that none of the others could see. Then, as protocol dictated, she held the position until he broke it first. Only when his hand lowered did hers follow suit, dropping cleanly to her side in a movement that looked like it had been drilled 1,000 times. The air in the room was electric, now heavy with questions no one dared ask. One petty officer near the back swallowed hard. He'd been in for years, and in all that time, he'd never seen the Admiral bypass the ranking officer to salute someone else first. Never. The Admiral stepped back slightly, giving her a nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't the shallow nod you give to someone you barely know. This was deeper earned. "You're a long way from your last theater, Captain," the Admiral said, his voice even, carrying just enough weight to make the title hit every ear in the room. "Captain, it wasn't shouted. It didn't have to be." The word hit like a flashbang, lining the assumptions that had been made about her since she first set foot in this building. The SEAL commander's jaw tightened not in anger, but in recalculation. This wasn't the civilian aide he'd thought she was. This wasn't some staff officer assigned to keep his calendar tidy and his paperwork in order. This was someone who carried a rank equivalent to his own. Someone the Admiral himself respected enough to break protocol for. And judging by the way the Admiral's tone shifted from formal to something almost like familiarity, it was clear they had history. Not the served in the same office kind of history. A kind forged in high-stakes operations, where failure isn't measured in losses on paper, but in names carved into memorial walls. "Sir," she replied simply, her voice steady, acknowledging his greeting with no visible pride, no flinch, no attempt to soften the weight of the moment. If the SEALs had been curious before, they were now burning with the need to know. Who was she? Where had she served? And what exactly had she done to warrant a salute from one of the most respected flag officers in the Navy? But none of them spoke. The Admiral turned to face the rest of the room, his presence shifting back into its usual commanding focus. But now there was an unspoken awareness. Whether or not they understood her story, every man in that room knew one thing. This woman's presence was not incidental. Before, she had been background noise, someone to glance past, someone to underestimate. Now, every eye followed her. Subtle movements, from the way she shifted her weight to the way she gripped the folder under her arm. And she noticed. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. Instead, she maintained the same quiet composure she'd held before the Admiral had. Walked in, because she knew something they didn't. This wasn't about recognition. It never was. The salute wasn't a performance for the room. It was an acknowledgement between warriors who had stood in the same kind of storms, who had made the same impossible calls under pressure. She knew the Admiral hadn't done it to impress anyone. Here, he'd done it because in the unspoken language of the battlefield, respect is paid where it's due, and it's paid in full. And if the rest of the room was suddenly seeing her differently, that was just a side effect. The Admiral moved on to the briefing, his voice taking on the crisp, mission-focused tone the SEALs were used to hearing. But now, as he spoke about operational risks, air support timelines, and contingencies for extraction, more than a few eyes kept darting toward her. They didn't know the details yet, but they understood enough. When the Admiral had saluted, he hadn't just acknowledged her rank. He'd marked her as someone whose presence could change the outcome of a mission. And that left them speechless. The silence after the salute was suffocating. Every set of eyes in the room was locked on her, searching for an explanation, but none came. She didn't rush to speak, didn't break the tension with a smile or a quip. She simply stood there tall, composed, her gaze steady on the Admiral. It was he who broke the stillness. "Good to see you again, Captain," he said, and though his tone carried warmth, there was a razor edge of respect beneath it. The word captain sliced through the air like a blade. The impact was immediate. Around her, men who had only moments ago been half distracted or smirking froze in place. Several exchanged quick, uncertain glances, like they'd just realized they were standing on a live minefield. Others stiffened unconsciously, hands twitching toward perfect posture. "Captain?" That one word detonated in the minds of every SEAL in the room. They replayed the last few days, their dismissive nods, the casual tone they'd taken, the way they'd brushed her off, as someone here to handle paperwork. The title did not match the image they had built in their heads. The Admiral didn't give them time to process. He took a step closer to her, voice lowering slightly. "It's been a while since Black Dagger. I heard you've been keeping a low profile." Black Dagger. The moment the Cody name left his lips, it was as if the air was sucked out of the room. Conversations about Black Dagger weren't casual. They didn't happen in hallways or over beers. It was one of those whispered operations that floated through the ranks like ghost stories, never officially confirmed, never acknowledged in writing, but unforgettable to anyone who had heard the details. The younger SEALs didn't know much, only that it had been an impossible mission, deep behind enemy lines, where a small team had been cut off from all support. The older operators, though, knew more. They remembered the classified after-action summaries, the rumors of a single operative navigating through miles of hostile territory to extract the team without firing a single shot. The few who knew the truth looked at her now with dawning recognition and unease. The Admiral turned, his gaze briefly to the commander, and then back to her. "You still running your own playbook?" he asked. A faint smile touched her lips. "Always, sir." The exchange was so natural, so devoid of hesitation, that it was clear they had done this before. There was no mistaking the dynamic. This was not a commander acknowledging an assistant. This was a superior greeting and equal. And then the Admiral did something no one expected. He addressed her by a name no one in that room had ever heard out loud before. A name wrapped in shadow, the kind that only appeared in the deepest, most restricted briefings. Shadow Viper. The name landed heavily, and several men unconsciously shifted their stance, as if bracing for something. Even the commander, who had been silent until now, blinked in surprise. He was a man not easily caught off guard. One of the younger SEALs, wide-eyed, mouthed the name silently, as if testing it against the air, as though saying it aloud might summon something dangerous. Shadow Viper wasn't just a call sign, it was a reputation. Stories about her, most of them unconfirmed, circulated in the special operations community like urban legends. They said she'd walked out of missions where the survival odds were 0. They said she could navigate enemy terrain blindfolded, could vanish into shadows so completely that even thermal scopes couldn't pick her up. But the most persistent rumor was the one about an op gone bad, an entire SEL platoon surrounded in hostile territory, every extraction route compromised. Command had considered them lost. And yet, 48 hours later, they were all airlifted. Out alive. No one knew exactly how. No one could explain why the enemy force seemed to collapse overnight. Until now, most had believed that story was just that, a story. But as the Admiral stood here, greeting her like an old comrade, the realization sank in. She wasn't just part of the legend. She was the legend. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. She simply held the Admiral's gaze, as if the rest of the room didn't exist. The Admiral, clearly aware of the stunned silence around them, allowed himself the smallest hint of a smirk. "These boys treating you well?" Her answer was cool, controlled. "They're learning." A ripple of tension ran through the ranks. No one missed the implication. The Admiral's eyes swept the room one last time. "You've got one of the best in the business here. Don't waste her time." The words hung in the air long after. He stepped back. She inclined her head in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Admiral." When he finally turned and moved toward the exit, the sound of his boots on the steel deck echoed like a drumbeat. Each step away seemed to give the room back its air, but not its ease. No one spoke immediately. It was as if they were all recalibrating, trying to reconcile the woman they'd assumed was just a logistical aid with the operative the Admiral had just acknowledged. Finally, one SEAL, voice low and hesitant, muttered, "Shadow Viper?" She didn't look at him. Instead, she gathered the documents from the table, stacked them neatly, and slid them into a folder marked classified, eyes only. Then, almost as an afterthought, she glanced in his direction. "Careful," she said quietly. "Some names shouldn't be spoken unless you're ready for what comes with them." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. The young SEAL shut his mouth immediately. As she walked toward the far end of the room, Conversations started up again, but they were different now, quieter, more cautious. She could feel the shift. No more sidelong smirks, no more casual dismissals. Every step she took left a trail. We calculated respect in its wake. She didn't need their admiration. She didn't even need them to like her. All she required was what she had now. Their attention, their understanding that she wasn't here to play the part they'd imagined. In their world, respect wasn't given, it was earned. And sometimes it wasn't earned in front of witnesses. It was earned years ago, in places no one would ever admit existed, in operations that would never make the news. The Admiral had just reminded them of that. And if they were smart, they'd remember it. The Admiral's words were still hanging in the air, but for the SEALs, time felt like it had slowed to a crawl. They weren't looking at her as the woman who handed out mission schedules or who fetched briefing packets anymore. They were looking at her like they'd just been told the ghost stories they'd heard around campfires were real and standing right in front of them. Her code name, 2 sharp, simple words, was one they'd heard whispered in classified debriefings. Shadow. Hawk. Even saying it felt like breaking some invisible rule. She'd been there in stories they thought were half legend. The extraction of a high-value target deep in enemy territory without a single casualty. The sabotage of a covert weapons shipment so deep in the desert the GPS was unreliable. The midnight strike that stopped a convoy carrying components for a dirty bomb without firing a single unsuppressed shot. All of those had been filed under unknown operative. Now they knew. And the woman who had been quietly passing them manila folders was her. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost measured, no bravado, no theatrics. You don't get to that point without a team, she said simply, eyes moving across the room. And you don't stay alive by telling your own story. One of the younger SEALs, Morales, opened his mouth to speak, then shut it. He wanted to ask a dozen questions about how she'd done it, about what it had felt like, but something in her days told him she wasn't the type to give away the details for entertainment. The Admiral glanced at his watch. We'll discuss the mission in a moment, he said to the SEAL commander. Then, looking back at her, he added, If you're willing, Commander, I'd like you to be in on this one. Commander. A title hit the SEALs like a shockwave. Not assistant. Not advisor, Commander. Her clearance and authority were suddenly clear. She nodded once, no hesitation. As the Admiral stepped aside to take a secure call, one of the older SEALs, Harlan, a man with 3 combat deployments, leaned toward her. You've been working with us for months, he murmured. Why didn't you say anything? She gave him a small, knowing smile. Because sometimes the best way to understand a team is to watch them when they think no one important is watching. It wasn't an insult. It was a truth, and Harlan knew it. They'd been under evaluation the entire time, and she'd probably learned more about their strengths and weaknesses in silence than she ever could have from a formal report. The room shifted, where before there had been casual dominance from. The SEALs, now there was a new undercurrent respect, but also curiosity. They were trained operators, men who'd seen combat and survived it. Yet this woman carried herself with the quiet gravity of someone who had operated in worlds they hadn't touched. Someone finally broke the silence. Morales spoke up, his voice cautious. They say Shadowhawk once walked into an enemy command tent, took the intel she needed, and walked out without being seen. That true? She tilted her head slightly. They say a lot of things. Her lips twitched in the faintest smirk. The truth is always less glamorous than the legend. The truth? Maybe. But the way she said it told them there was more probably. A lot more she would never share. The Admiral returned. The secure call ended. All right, he said. Voice all business again. New orders have come down. High value objective. Remote territory. time-sensitive. He looked around the table, then back at her. Shadowhawk will take point on operational planning. The SEAL commander nodded without protest. That alone told the men how high her standing was. Commanders didn't hand over operational lead unless they had complete trust. She stepped forward to the digital display, fingers tapping rapidly across the touchscreen. Satellite images came up, terrain schematics, projected movement of the target. As she spoke, her voice was precise, economical, no wasted words, no wasted time. She mapped out infiltration routes, extraction windows, and contingencies they hadn't even considered. Every operator in the room was riveted. Where their mission briefings usually involved straightforward assault or extraction, hers felt airtight, not because she overcomplicated things, but because she accounted for every possible shift the situation could throw at them. At one point, she zoomed in on a narrow canyon, explaining a potential ambush site. "You'll want overwatch here," she said, glancing at Morales. "I've seen your long-range scores. You'll make the shot if needed." It wasn't just strategy, it was personal. She'd been watching them, learning exactly who could do what under pressure. The younger SEALs leaned forward, hanging on her every word. The older ones, Harlan included, nodded slowly, already adjusting their mindset. This wasn't just another mission. This was the kind of op where a single wrong move could get them all killed, and somehow they felt safer, knowing she was leading it. By the time the briefing ended, the mood in the room had completely changed. There was no longer a single man who thought of her as the assistant. They were looking at her the way soldiers look at someone who's been exactly where they're going and lived to tell about it. The Admiral dismissed the group, but before they filed out, he turned to her one last time. "It's been a long time since you've led a SEAL team," he said, his voice low. "But I know I'm putting them in the best possible hands." Her expression didn't change much, but for the first time that day, there was something in her eyes. Not pride exactly, maybe something deeper. Responsibility, memory, and perhaps the faint shadow of a past she'd never completely escaped. Outside the briefing room, the SEALs gathered in the hallway, their usual joking and noise replaced by low murmurs. Harlan broke the silence first. "You know what this means, right? We're about to find out why they tell stories about her." Morales swallowed, suddenly aware of the weight of what they were stepping into. "And I just hope," he said quietly, "that when it's over, we've got our own story to tell." Inside the room, she was still at the table, methodically reviewing every plan, every angle. The mission was already in motion in her mind. And for her, there was no such thing as just another op. This one mattered. And for the first time, since the Admiral's salute, she allowed herself the smallest thought. Let's see if they're ready. The room still carried the lingering shock of what had happened minutes earlier. The Admiral had left, but the imprint of his salute to her hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. The SEALs, men and women who had seen things most people wouldn't believe, stood quieter than usual. The sound of shuffling papers and the occasional clink of a coffee mug seemed louder than it should. She sat back at her station, scrolling through classified files on her secure laptop, acting as if nothing had happened. Her fingers moved with the same precision they always did, typing in strings of code, cross-checking mission parameters, and sending encrypted communications. But now, every move she made was being watched. Petty Officer Ramirez, who had once called her clipboard lady in jest, kept glancing her way. He'd never paid much attention to her before now. He seemed to be studying her like one would study an enemy target, cautiously, carefully, and with growing respect. Across the room, Chief Petty Officer Gangels, a 20-year veteran with more combat patches than anyone else in the building, finally broke the silence. "Ma'am," he began, the word sounding foreign in his mouth when directed toward her, "I didn't realize She didn't look up. "That's the point, Chief," she replied evenly, her voice calm, but carrying an undercurrent of authority that left no room for debate. It wasn't arrogance, it was fact. Everything about her demeanor, now that they were really looking, was military precision disguised in civilian subtlety. Her posture was perfect. Her awareness of the room was total eyes flicking from screen to door, in a rhythm only someone with combat instincts would have. One of the younger SEALs, Harris, couldn't take it anymore. He stepped closer. I read about Operation Black Harpoon back in training. The one where the infiltration team made it out of the Venezuelan compound undetected. Was that?" She cut him off with a small, knowing smile. "You've been reading the declassified version." The others leaned in almost imperceptibly, hungry for more, but she didn't elaborate. Instead, she focused back on her screen, leaving them to stew in curiosity. Her silence wasn't dismissive, it was strategic. She knew that mystery would make them want to know more, but she'd reveal only what was necessary. Finally, Commander Briggs, the SEAL team leader she'd been assisting for weeks, approached. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. Her eyes met his for the first time that day. "Because your team needed to treat me as they saw me, not as a reputation, not as a rank. If I'd come in wearing my history, you'd have looked at me differently from day one. And in this line of work, assumptions can get people killed." Briggs didn't argue. He'd been in enough high-risk operations to know she was right. By mid-afternoon, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The SEALs who once passed her without a second glance now sought her opinion on gear loadouts, on mission infiltration, points, even on psychological profiles of targets. And she didn't just answer, she dissected their plans with surgical precision, spotting weaknesses they hadn't considered and offering alternatives that made them look at her with something approaching awe. Harris came back later, dropping a tactical map on her desk. "Ma'am, can you take a look?" The SAT recon's fuzzy around the northern perimeter, and, before he could finish, she pointed to a small, barely noticeable elevation line. "There's a natural ridgeline here, perfect for a concealed overwatch position. Move your sniper team there, and you'll have both visual coverage and fallback protection." Harris blinked. "That's brilliant." She just shrugged. "It's obvious when you've been the sniper." Even the grizzled Daniels found himself asking her about gear modifications. She gave him a tip on adjusting the trigger pull on his sidearm that shaved milliseconds off his draw time, a tiny detail that could mean the difference between life and death. It wasn't long before the quiet, understated assistant was the center of a low orbit of SEALs, each one realizing just how wrong their assumptions had been. And yet, despite the newfound attention, she didn't gloat. There were no smug remarks, no lectures about judging people too quickly. She simply kept doing what she'd been doing all along, making the mission better, stronger, safer. By the end of the day, the tone in the operations center was different. They no longer looked at her like background noise. They looked at her like one of their own, maybe even someone they'd follow into the most dangerous places on Earth. And in the back of their minds, every single one of them wondered the same thing. If she could stay hidden in plain sight for this long, just how many other legends walked among them, invisible until the moment they chose to be seen? The thought was unsettling. But for her, it was just another day at work. The following morning, the base was alive with an unusual energy. Word had spread quickly SEALs were notorious for keeping operational secrets. But when it came to stories like this, whispers traveled faster than any encrypted comms line. Everyone wanted to know more about the woman who had gone from the commander's assistant to a figure the Admiral himself had saluted. She walked in quietly, coffee in hand, wearing the same unassuming tactical cargo pants and base-issue hoodie. As before, if she noticed the shift in atmosphere, she didn't let it show. But her eyes took in every detail, the way conversations paused when she passed, the sideways glances from operators who pretended not to be staring, the subtle nods from men, and women who, until yesterday, barely registered her existence. Commander Briggs was waiting for her at the briefing table, his expression unreadable. "We're up," he said simply. She placed her coffee down, her calmness a stark contrast to the tension hanging in the room. The team filed in, one by one, their boots heavy on the floor. Some of them avoided her gaze, still processing the shift in their understanding. Others stared openly now, unapologetically curious. The wall screen flickered to life, showing grainy drone footage of a compound, tucked into a mountain valley, guarded and fortified like a fortress. "This," Briggs began, "is our target." He didn't bother with the usual slow build-up. This wasn't a warm-up drill. High-value arms broker. Supplies to cartels, insurgent cells, and anyone with enough money. He's slippery intel. Says he's moved locations 6 times in the last month. This is the first time we've had him locked down long enough to get boots in. She leaned forward, studying the footage. "Perimeter?" she asked. "Triple layered. 2-man patrols, thermal sensors, and a drone overwatch," Briggs replied. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "He's expecting a raid." Briggs nodded grimly. "Exactly." It was then that Daniel spoke up from the back of the room, his voice carrying a new weight of respect. "Ma'am, what's your call?" Heads turned instantly. It was the first time anyone had openly deferred to her in front of the team. She didn't hesitate. "You breach from the north, you'll walk into a kill box. The drone patterns suggest they're luring you there. Their actual weak point is here." She pointed to a narrow, rocky ledge, barely visible on the satellite overlay. "It's a dead zone for their thermal sensors, but it requires a vertical climb under cover of darkness. No margin for error." "Doable?" Harris asked. She gave him a look that was half amusement, half challenge. "Everything's doable. If you plan for it." Briggs didn't argue. He trusted her read more than any recon algorithm. "All right. We move at 0200, full gear." And he paused, looking at her. "You're coming with us." It wasn't a question. The room went still. The SEALs glanced at each other, not out of doubt, but anticipation. Yesterday, they would have balked at the idea of her in the field. With them. Today, there was a quiet certainty that if she was there, the mission would have a better chance of success. That night, the team moved out under a moonless sky. The air was cold, a kind of cold that made every breath feel sharper. The helicopters flew dark, rotors slicing through the night with a low, steady thrum. Inside, no one spoke. Gear checks were done by touch, gloved hands running over rifles, magazines, comms units. She sat between Daniels and Harris, eyes closed, running the plan through her mind, not because she doubted it, but because she knew the difference between thinking you're ready and being ready. When the chopper set down a few clicks from the target, the cold mountain air rushed in like a living thing. The team moved quickly, low to the ground, the crunch of gravel under boots barely audible against the wind. The climb was brutal. The ledge she'd chosen as their entry point was narrow, slick with frost, and unforgiving. One slip could mean a fall into the ravine below. But she moved like she'd been born to the terrain, hands and feet finding holds without hesitation. Harris, behind her, gritted his teeth and tried to keep up. At the top, they crouched in the shadow of the compound wall. The guards were close enough now that she could hear their muffled voices over the wind. She signaled with 2 fingers hold. She studied their patrol pattern for exactly 30 seconds, then motioned forward. In less than a minute, the first 2 guards were down, no gunfire, no noise, just silent, efficient takedowns. Daniels muttered under his breath. Holy, but caught himself before finishing. Inside the compound, the mission unfolded with surgical precision. Every route she'd predicted was exactly as she'd described. Every timing gap she'd noted was accurate to the second. It was as if she'd already run the mission before tonight. The target was secured without a single shot fired, a rarity in operations like this. The extraction was clean, the team vanishing back into the mountains before the enemy even knew what had happened. Back at the base, adrenaline still ran high. The target was in custody, gear was being stowed, and the SEALs were riding the quiet high of a perfect op. Briggs approached her, his tone softer now. You didn't have to come. But you did. She met his gaze. I don't send people where I wouldn't go myself. The others gathered nearby, not as an audience, but as comrades. Daniels gave a single nod, small, but heavy with meaning. Harris just shook his head, grinning. Ma'am, you're not an assistant. She cut him off gently. I'm part of the team. That's all that matters. The respect was no longer unspoken, it was absolute. She had not only earned her place among them, she had redefined it. And while most stories would end there, with a clean op and newfound respect, she knew better. In their world, the next mission was always coming. The salute from the Admiral, the whispers in the halls, the flawless mission. These were moments, not endpoints. Tomorrow, she would walk into another room. Another team might underestimate her, and the cycle would begin again. But for tonight, in this room, among these warriors, she was exactly where she belonged.